What is happening, everybody? Welcome back to another video, and this is actually, I guess, kind of like a part 2. Earlier in the week, I had done a video called Guitars Beginners Should Avoid, and a lot of you suggested, well, could you do a video on amps beginners should avoid? And I was like, well, of course, that sounds like a great idea. So, real quick, the amp that I'm playing through, I'm just playing through my gold top loaded with P90s into my Axe actually right now, and I'll be talking about that here in a second. But let's kind of dive into these different kind of amps that I think are better, just kind of not suited for beginners necessarily. If you haven't seen the guitar one, I'll link that down below in the comments. You can go check that out as well. Alright, so amp number 1, and of course there's going to be some debate about this. I'm always happy to hear what you guys think, and if you have suggestions of your own, please leave them down below in the comments. But the first one I'm going to say are computer amps. Now, some of you guys might think that that is extremely, I'm thinking more like desktop, stuff like that. And the reason why I think it might not be the best thing for a beginner, because a lot of those, software units that you have to use, you need an interface, you need a DAW sometimes, all these different steps, and I really think the simpler the process is for a beginner to get to playing, the better. You don't want to have to boot up your computer, open the program, turn your interface. There's all these extra steps, and I just feel like, a small combo amp is gonna make it easier. You want to play guitar, you just plug in, because one of the hardest things to capture when you're a beginner starting out, so I think one of the most difficult things to capture as a beginner is that inspiration and motivation, and you don't want to have all these different settings that you need to do and all that kind of stuff to get in the way of that. Now the next amp that you might want to avoid getting are amps without headphone jacks. There are so many good practice amps out there these days, and I'm actually going to recommend a couple here at the end of the video, but yeah, headphone jacks, very important, because unfortunately this is nothing against beginners, because we're all a beginner at some point, and I'm pretty sure my wife wishes that I would still use headphones, but when we're learning a lot of this stuff, we're kind of plunking around. It might be disturbing to them if that's something you care about. And I just think that having a headphone jack is very, very crucial. That way, you can practice. And also, some people are just self-conscious when they're playing, and they don't want others to hear it. So having some headphones in those beginning stages on that headphone jack on an amp, super crucial. So maybe stick to amps that have headphone jacks. Or if there's some kind of device that can do it, but then again, that's adding another step. So maybe just stick to amps with headphones. Number 3, giant tube heads. Now, I don't have any 100-watt tube amps, but I do have, a couple different tube amps here, and I think that tube amps, definitely, a big one. For one, they can be kind of expensive, and you want to, how do I say this nicely? In the beginning stages, you don't really understand what your sound is, or your tone, or the tone that you really like. You just might like I just like distorted guitar. And I'm not saying that in any kind of condescending way. It's just, I remember what I thought was good tone was a Fender 212, and I had a death metal pedal, and I thought it sounded great. And now I've heard those pedals, and I'm like, that is so bad. You don't need to sink that kind of money into a starter amp, like I said. And for one, you're going to need a cabinet. There's more rules that apply to using a tube amp, like making sure it has a load and all this kind of stuff, because otherwise you're going to damage and blow up the amp. And it's just, you don't want to have to worry about that. I think combo amps are much better for beginners. Now, another one you'll probably hear people talk about are similar things to what I'm using right now, which is the Axe or Kemper. There's all kinds of these preamps out there, which are amps. It's just the issue is you can't play them through an amp cabinet without also having a power amp. So again, you're getting more and more stuff. And also, I think that an Axe something like that, is just too expensive and too overkill for a beginner to start with. Because again, we're going back to that thing that, your ear just isn't really developed at this point, and you're going to have too much stuff going on here. There's nothing wrong with having effects. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later on when I recommend an amp. But I think stuff like Axe, Kemper, those guys, Helix, AX8, any of those things, they're so just kind of too much. for a beginner to really understand what all the stuff is even doing. So I would maybe stay away from those. And, you know. Now the next one I want to talk about is those starter amps that come in the kits. Now a lot of you guys commented on the guitar video saying that you started out on a kit guitar, which is totally fine, and you know, you thought it was great. And I think that, you know, those are great. I just think that there are much better options, possibly, if you're willing to put in a little bit more money. But as always, it needs to be stated that just use whatever you have. So those starter amps, in my opinion, are some of the, just being honest, some of the worst sounding amps. I still have my original. It's called an Excel. It was like a knockoff of a knockoff amp. And yeah, it just sounds really, really rough. You know, at the end of the day, like I said, it's better than no amp, but there's so many good options out there nowadays for relatively, you know, an inexpensive amount of money in the grand scheme of it all. So it's just, if you can avoid those, because again, I know our ears aren't developed early on, but it makes a difference if you have a little bit of a better amp than that. But again, I'm not trying to put anybody down for starting with one of those. It's just there are much better options out there. Alright, so now I thought I would recommend a couple of amps to you guys who are maybe looking into stuff. You're probably like, well, Robert, you just said no to everything. What do you say yes to? First of all, doesn't really matter what I think. This is just my opinions on stuff. And second of all, I think one of the best amps I ever had for a practice amp, my God, I wish they still made these. They were so good. I literally, when I worked at a music store and they came in used, every student like, you guys got one of those? And they'd go buy it. Are the Fender G-Decks. I think it's the G-Deck 1. I'll put a picture up here on the screen. If you ever see one of those and it still works, I used to have one. I sold it with a guitar, you know, for super cheap to someone who was starting out, again, to try to give them a better amp. But those were so good. You could record up to like 15 seconds of yourself. You have backing tracks, lots of different tones, just one dial. It's not kind of like overkill. It has a headphone jack. You could actually play MP3s through the amp. To me, those were, and they sounded good. You know, I always thought that the distortion in those sounded good, even to this day. I played one not too long ago at a Guitar Center, and I was just like, this amp still sounds great. Why did Fender ever quit doing this? The Fender Mustang is another great amp. It doesn't do all the recording and stuff like that. But there, you know, any of those amps in that vein, the Boss Katana, that's another like fantastic one. Was it the Katana Air, the little tiny one? Those things sound great. So I think that for those, they're just a little bit more expensive than those starter amps, but they are just so much better. So overall, to wrap things up for you here, what I basically recommend is some kind of small, you know, combo amp of some kind that possibly has some effects in it, and a headphone jack, all that stuff. Fender Mustang, Fender G-Deck, Boss Katana, what's the PV Vipers, all that kind of stuff are super, super good. I remember when I first got, when the Spider 1 Line 6 amps came out, which I know a lot of people don't like those, but when I first got it, I was upgrading from that Fender 212, and I was just like, oh my God, I have all these effects and all. It was just a fun amp. But yeah, definitely check out that stuff. Check out the guitar video if you haven't yet. And other than that, guys, we'll see you later. Whoop! Bam!